Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop f8 to b4. Pawn e4 to e5. Pawn h7 to h6. Bishop g5 to d2. Bishop b4 takes c3. Pawn b2 takes c3. Knight f6 to e4. Queen d1 to g4. Pawn g7 to g6. Bishop d2 to c1. Knight e4 takes c3. Queen g4 to h3. Knight c3 to e4. Pawn f2 to f3. Knight e4 to g5. Queen h3 to g3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn d4 takes c5. Queen d8 to a5, check. Bishop c1 to d2. Queen a5 takes c5. Bishop f1 to d3. Knight g5 to h7. Knight g1 to e2. Knight h7 to f8. Pawn f3 to f4. Knight b8 to c6. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight f8 to d7. Bishop d2 to e3. Queen c5 to a5. Castle kingside. Knight d7 to c5. Bishop d3 takes g6. Rook h8 to g8. Queen g3 to f2. Knight c5 to a4. Bishop g6 to h7. Rook g8 to h8. Queen f2 to g3. Knight a4 takes c3. Knight e2 takes c3. Queen a5 takes c3. Rook f1 to e1. Queen c3 to a3. Queen g3 to g7. Queen a3 to f8. Queen g7 takes f8, check. Rook h8 takes f8. Rook e1 to c1. Bishop c8 to d7. Rook a1 to b1. Pawn b7 to b6. Bishop h7 to d3. Knight c6 to e7. Rook b1 to b3. Pawn f7 to f6. Rook b3 to a3. Bishop d7 to c6. Rook a3 to c3. Bishop c6 to a4. Rook c3 to a3. Bishop a4 to c6. Rook a3 to c3. Bishop c6 to d7. Rook c3 to a3. Knight e7 to c8. Bishop e3 to d4. Pawn f6 to f5. Bishop d3 to a6. Rook f8 to f7. Rook c1 to c7. King e8 to d8. Rook a3 to c3. Rook a8 to b8. Bishop a6 to b5. Pawn h6 to h5. Bishop d4 to f2. Bishop d7 to e8. Rook c7 takes f7. Bishop e8 takes f7. Bishop f2 to h4, check. Knight c8 to e7. Rook c3 to c6. Bishop f7 to e8. Rook c6 to d6, check. King d8 to c7. Bishop b5 takes e8. Rook b8 takes e8. Rook d6 takes e6. King c7 to d7. Rook e6 to d6, check. King d7 to c7. King g1 to f2. Pawn d5 to d4. King f2 to f3. Knight e7 to g8. Bishop h4 to f2. Rook e8 to d8. Rook d6 takes d8. King c7 takes d8. Bishop f2 takes d4. King d8 to e7. Pawn h2 to h3. King e7 to e6. Pawn g2 to g4. Pawn h5 takes g4, check. Pawn h3 takes g4. Knight g8 to e7. Bishop d4 to c3. Knight e7 to d5. Bishop c3 to e1. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop e1 to d2. Pawn b6 to b5. Pawn a2 to a3. Knight d5 to b6. Bishop d2 to c3. Knight b6 to c4. Bishop c3 to b4. Pawn f5 takes g4, check. King f3 to e4. King e6 to f7. Bishop b4 to c5. Knight c4 to d2, check. King e4 to d5. Knight d2 to b3. Pawn e5 to e6, check. King f7 to e8. Bishop c5 to e3. Knight b3 to a5. Pawn f4 to f5. Knight a5 to b7. Pawn f5 to f6. Knight b7 to d8. Bishop e3 to f4. Knight d8 to f7. Pawn e6 takes f7, check. King e8 takes f7. King d5 to e5. Pawn a6 to a5. King e5 to f5. Pawn b5 to b4. Pawn a3 takes b4. Pawn a5 takes b4. Bishop f4 to e5. Pawn b4 to b3. King f5 takes g4. King f7 to e8. King g4 to f5. King e8 to d7. Bishop e5 to c3. King d7 to d6. Bishop c3 to b2. King d6 to c5. Pawn f6 to f7. King c5 to c4. Pawn f7 to f8, promoting to queen. King c4 to d3. Queen f8 to c5. King d3 to d2. King f5 to f4. King d2 to e2. King f4 to g3. King e2 to d2. King g3 to f2. King d2 to d3. Queen c5 to c3, check. King d3 to e4. Queen c3 to f3, checkmate.